Welcome everyone to Lessons We Can't Forget, a webinar on the use of narrative strategy, specifically mitigation, used in advocating for a different approach to the repair of harm. Today we'll be joined by Annie Ruhnke, Director of Mitigation at YSRP, and two YSRP client partners, Amina Phillips and Jamie Silvanik, to talk about their own experiences with this work. Because Jamie is currently incarcerated, her answers to our questions will be read aloud by a YSRP staff member, inviting her into a room where she can't currently be present. Today's event is presented by YSRP, an organization that works to keep children out of adult jails and prisons, and to bring home people who were sentenced as children to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Those two distinct populations, those sentenced to life without parole as children and those currently being threatened with or prosecuted as adults, are at the crux of today's discussion, but more on that later. First, I'm going to start with our friend Annie. And if you don't mind telling the group today a little bit about what goes into preparing a mitigation report and what is the narrative you're hoping to put forward on behalf of our client partners.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Mark. So I'm going to just give a little bit of background on myself and how I came to work at YSRP. I assure you it is relevant, and I'll land the plane and answer your question, Mark. So I joined YSRP in 2016 as a mitigation specialist. I was specifically hired to work with juvenile lifers, folks who were being resentenced following the decision in Montgomery, allowing them to come home after being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole as children. Prior to that, I worked at the Federal Public Defender in a capital habeas unit doing post-conviction death penalty cases and attempting to use mitigation and mitigation investigation to find relief for those individuals. So I joined YSRP 2016. In 2019, I transitioned to working with young people in addition to working with juvenile lifers, young people currently being charged as adults in Philadelphia and surrounding counties. How I came to know Amina, it's how I came to know Jamie, but a little bit more on that later. And really throughout my career, I've seen a sort of a spectrum of cases with different positionality within the system and the sort of how the system goes. With post-conviction death penalty cases, we really were forced to only look backwards. We were only looking at what happened at the trial, what happened leading up to the trial, and we could only really investigate what wasn't found at the time of trial. With juvenile lifer cases, it was really exciting. This was a chance for us to be looking forwards. Not only for the first time, I was able to work with individuals and tell stories that had real hope, that had a full spectrum. We got to see completed arcs of change and tell forward-looking narratives, and learned a lot about people and who they had become. We got to tell stories of what we knew was possible at its core, right? What we all know, right? That people change, people grow, young people especially mature and develop. And we saw through these narratives and these stories, through that were told through interviews with family members, interviews with loved ones, interviews with the person being resentenced themselves, records, diving into their stories that way, that this change was not only likely, it was inevitable. Every single person that I encountered in juvenile life or resentencings had grown and changed and was different than the person that was told that they were going to die in prison. And I try to take the lessons that I learned from those cases, from those narratives into the work that we're doing with young people today and the narratives that we're trying to tell. We're telling stories of their life, and trying to show decision makers not only just who they are and to help them understand how they came to where they are in that current moment, which is facing, charges of causing serious harm. But also we want to make those same decision makers imagine where those young people could go. And a lot of our mitigation narratives are to focus on completing that arc in the imagination of the decision makers, understanding that young people are inherently different, in that they can grow and that they can change and that there is a future. We want those decision makers to try to see that arc, even though it hasn't happened yet. This is probably obviously and understandably a lot more difficult than it was with juvenile lifer cases where those individuals had already completed those arcs in a lot of changes, in a lot of circumstances, a lot of cases. They had changed, they had grown, they were able to look back on themselves as teenagers. The young people that we're encountering in this pre-trial, really the only thing that the decision makers know about them that we know, right, is what has happened. And so a lot of times we have to help decision makers in our mitigation narratives understand what could be possible for young people today facing serious charges.
Thanks, Annie. And so I had a little bit of a different role when I came to YSRP to introduce myself. I've worked in both development and communications for the organization and kept running into this challenge that Annie is naming here because they're two distinct populations. And in one, we end up telling a story of productivity and change over time. And in the other, we're telling a story about possibility and potential. And despite stated beliefs of many involved, they were being received very differently, both in terms of advocacy and fundraising success from my perspective, which is one of the things that led to our webinar today, was to talk about this interesting distinction and how we might apply the lessons of the Montgomery decision and of our juvenile lifers to advocate for changes for those currently experiencing the adult system. And to help us learn about how clear the potential is, often so soon after we meet them, Annie is going to introduce two people that she's come to care for deeply through her work at YSRP. And Annie, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our two guests.
Sure. I'll start by introducing Jamie, who, as Mark said, is unfortunately not able to actually be here with us live, but Jamie is a really wonderful, unique individual, and we wanted to make sure that her voice could still be heard in this room. We're having a YSRP staff member read her answers on her behalf, and I'm going to read her bio from a copy of her amazing book of poetry that she wrote. So Jamie Sylvanik is a writer, activist, prison abolitionist, and college student at Ohio University. She has written for the Prison Journalism Project, the Juvenile Justice Information Exchange, George Washington University's Women in Beyond the Global, and numerous social justice zines. At 14, Jamie was sentenced to 35 years to life in prison, which she's currently serving at SCI Muncie in Pennsylvania. In her spare time, she enjoys training dogs, tutoring, working out, reading nerdy books, stuffing her face, and challenging misconceptions about incarcerated human beings. So that is Jamie, and we're going to hear from her and her beautiful writing in a little bit. I'll also introduce Amina. So Amina Phillips and I came to know each other in 2020, I believe, 2021, Amina. Amina is a wonderful activist. She served on the Youth Advisory Board for the campaign to end the poor treatment of youth in Pennsylvania who are involved in the justice system through care, not control. She is an advocate for youth who are system involved. She is a mom, an amazing mom to a 4-year-old, a lover of cats and animals of all kinds. And Amina and I got to know each other when she was facing very serious charges in Delaware County. The district attorney's office was had not yet, but threatening to charge her as an adult. So Amina and I got to know each other through work there. I learned a lot about advocacy from Amina, and how she was able to advocate for herself in a really difficult situation. And just so thrilled to have you here with us, Amina.
Thank you, Annie.
I will start by asking the first question. I think in terms of structure, it makes sense that we have Jamie's response read first in case it elicits anything else in Amina's response. So we'll start with Jamie and ask, can you share a little bit about how you came to know YSRP and how the mitigation process might have changed how you think about or tell your story? And these are answers that Jamie provided to us in writing. So these are her words, and I'll ask our friend Margot to read them.
I first came to know YSRP around 2017 when Joanna and Katie visited Muncie to discuss their work to support systems impacted young people. A couple of years later, the Juvenile Law Center began representing me for my post-conviction appeals, and YSRP joined to conduct interviews and prepare a mitigation report to present to the court. Though my appeals were ultimately denied, YSRP has continued to actively work with and support me, especially as we are now pursuing commutation. Working with YSRP has been formative for understanding and sharing my story, as well as for beginning my own healing journey. I was incarcerated at 14 and sentenced as an adult for my role in my mom's murder. I couldn't understand how something so horrific had happened to my family, much less that I had been a participant and bore responsibility for her death. I wasn't equipped to process all of it, and I was consumed with feelings of guilt and self-loathing. As a result, I internalized the message that I was an innately bad person. I subscribed to the disposability culture that defines our nation's legal system and how we collectively respond to harm. It's far easier to label and dispose of someone who is responsible for causing harm than it is to do the hard work of understanding the forces that informed their decision making. YSRP helped me understand the trauma I had experienced prior to incarceration and how it influenced the choices I had made. For the first time since I was arrested, I was heard, validated, and seen as a whole human being. YSRP provided me a new framework for understanding my trauma and decisions, which is necessary for both accountability and for healing. Having my story more fully told helped me begin to believe that I am far more than both the trauma I've experienced and the worst decisions I've made. No one is static. We are all constantly growing and changing. This is true even for young people who are responsible for causing harm. Because I was sentenced as an adult, I've had to grow up in prison in an inherently traumatic environment that isn't conducive to healing or helping young people grow into healthy adults. In spite of prison, I've been working to create a life that I am proud of even while incarcerated. My personal growth has only occurred due to the unwavering support of my family, friends, and people at YSRP. Because others were able to see goodness and potential in me, even in the aftermath of my worst decisions, I have been able to believe in it as well.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Um, Amina, I want to turn it over to you to tell us a little bit about how you came to know YSRP and how the mitigation process impacted you.
So I came to know YSRP, like Annie said, around 2020, when I was incarcerated in a juvenile detention center called Lima. I remember first, prior to meeting Annie, my charge was attempted murder, and I remember not really knowing like at all what was going to happen. It's not like something that people prepare you for. And I was 16 years old. I remember that same day, there was a boy who also received an adult charge. And what they do is they basically just come in, put you in shackles, and take you out. You go right to the adult jail. Thankfully, I was able to meet Annie not too long after. And, I really sat down with Annie and talked about just like my life and all of the trauma that I had experienced that contributed to the series of decisions that led me to be in Lima. And then receiving that charge. I remember Annie compiling the mitigation report for me. And I think something that really stood out to me and something that really was helpful is, Annie was reaching out to many, many different people that were in my life, even like a teacher I had in eighth grade. And something that was important for me, I think, like in reframing the way that the mitigation reframed my story was in the story, it did tell everything of all the trauma that I'd been through that, helped me get to where I was, but also mentioned all of the good things that I'd done. It wasn't really just about all of those things that I had done negatively, but the fact that I also had positive aspects in my life. And as I was still talking to Annie, I still had hopes for the future, despite, maybe not having one, had that gone the wrong way, but I still had a lot of hopes and I had a lot of goals and they were all positive. And just looking at that report kind of made me feel more like a person and not just, a list of charges that someone slid across the table to me. Um, so yeah.
Great. Thank you, Amina. I'm just enjoying looking at like the prideful face on Annie as these responses are given. Annie, I'm going to turn back to you. to tell us a little bit about this, these sort of two populations that we're talking about. So, what do you think was learned from the process of bringing home? I think the number's around 500 former juvenile lifers after the Montgomery decision. And how do you feel like those lessons are being applied today in the cases of those at the front end of the arc instead of 30 or 40 years into the arc?
Thanks, Mark. And yeah, it's about, I think, a little over 300 juvenile lifers who are home now. Almost everyone there were 500 total folks to be resentenced. So Pennsylvania has welcomed home a great deal of folks who are doing amazing things. And by amazing things, I mean just living everyday life after suffering decades of trauma and being told they were going to die in prison. It's an incredible, inspiring thing that we got to witness over the last, decade. If anyone knows me, they've heard me talk about this in terms of my frustrations with how what the moment was and what we got to witness watching folks be resentenced. It felt like a wrong was being collectively righted. A wrong that almost everyone could agree was wrong. We were in the position of celebrating outcomes. We were in the position of, as an advocacy community, as a legal community, in the justice system, really patting ourselves on the back and saying we're doing the right thing, right? And that includes, I think, judges, DAs, the DOC, parole. We were all working together to bring, even though, towards something that we, for the most part, could all agree on, right? That this was wrong and that needed to be righted. That folks who had been told they were going to die in prison not only shouldn't be dying in prison, but should be coming home much sooner than that. And that we wanted to support them in that journey. It is deeply frustrating now to be working with teenagers who are facing similar or the same charges as juvenile lifers were decades ago, who we are continuing to send to prison for decades. It's hard to understand now what happened to that cooperation, that kind of mutual understanding of what we all know inherently, like I said, to be true, that young people are capable of change, that they're more than the worst thing they've ever done. We all are, but young people especially are capable of change, of growing, of making different decisions, of regretting decisions that were made. I look at Jamie and Amina sitting here today, and I mean, they're both of them. I've known them both now for a long period of time. I think I met you both around the same time. Maybe Jamie a little earlier. And the growth I've seen just in that period of time is incredible. It was always there. You're not different people, but the maturity that has come into place just by being allowed to grow older, to experience life, and seeing Amina on the outside, being able to do all the amazing things you've done, be an amazing mother, fabulous daughter, just great friend. I'm a huge Amina. Someone said they're here as the Amina fan club. I agree. I'm on that fan club too. And I'm the Jamie fan club too as well, right? And it's just this sort of interesting parallel directions that you guys have gone in, where Amina, you were able to stay in the juvenile system. Jamie was not given that opportunity, right? And so that doesn't mean that she's not living a full life and doing amazing things. But it does mean that her abilities and what she's able to do is limited drastically. It really makes me wonder what we have learned from those all those resentencings that we all congratulated ourselves for, and what we have yet to unlearn. Children after Miller Montgomery, children for the most part are no longer facing sentences of life without the possibility of parole, but they're still facing extremely harsh sentences. When the bar in Pennsylvania is life without parole, 35 years may sound like mercy, or something like mercy to some people, but practically it is still very punitive. We know from the juvenile life rate that it doesn't take 35 years for someone to change and to grow. And that's the sentence that Jamie's currently serving. So the question is, why are we still doing this? Knowing what we know, why is this what we're doing? What are we looking to gain out of sentencing a child to decades in prison? Who is it for? Who is it bettering? And how can we be better obtaining what we are trying to accomplish in the criminal justice system? And while those are big questions, there's even larger questions here as well that we need to be asking ourselves of what do we do with young people who cause real harm? How do we create a system that centers healing for the people who have been harmed? At the juvenile lifer resentencings, I witnessed what looked like kind of ad hoc restorative justice in some cases where there had never been an opportunity for the person who caused harm being resentenced and the families that had lost their loved ones to violence to be in the same space and recognize the healing that existed in each other for that person to say, I'm sorry, I will never be able to undo what I did. And to have that family receive that looked like real healing to me. It's hard to see when someone gets sentenced to decades in prison and that is never allowed to happen, how that's real healing. How do we help young people finish that arc and get to the place where we know they can get to without sending them to decades in prison? I'm asking all these questions. I don't necessarily have all the answers, but I can say with confidence that it is not locking children up and throwing away the key, and that we all just need to keep it working together towards a better solution.
If you have the answers to Annie's questions, you're welcome to put them in the
I
chat.
would love to know. That would be helpful. Thank you, Mark.
But also, if Annie's questions bring up more for you, we encourage you to use the Q&A function because we will get to them in a little bit if you have questions about the issues coming up, because there are a lot of big ones, overlapping ones, complicated ones that we want to grapple with together. Going back to Amina and Jamie, and again, we'll ask Jamie's words to be read first. What would you want your judge to know about the life you're trying to live now? And what's the life story you hope to tell in 20 or 30 years?
I would want my judge to know that I'm trying my best to honor my mom and my family's love for me and work to repair the harm that I've caused. I am determined to be a person who they can be proud of and contribute positively to my communities, both inside and outside of prison. I believe it is my obligation, a debt I've incurred that I will never be able to repay, but I have to try regardless. The life story I want to be able to tell in 20 or 30 years is one of accountability, healing, and redemption. I will forever be haunted by my guilt. I will live with the devastating consequences of my actions for the rest of my life. Though I cannot change the past or exert much control over my immediate circumstances, I have the power to strive to live out my values through my actions, to practice active hope. And I hope that these efforts will eventually result in me looking back over my life and seeing that even though I caused irreparable harm, my life still had value. I hope to one day tell a story in which my worst decisions are only chapters of a long, complicated, and beautiful life.
Thank you. Amina, I'll ask you the same question. You have an opportunity to be building a new life on the outside as we speak, and I'm curious what you want your judge to know about the life you're living now, and what you hope to tell them in 20 or 30 years.
So actually, it's funny enough that I ended up actually working with the kids I work with in systems. I ended up working with my same judge, maybe like 2.5 years after, I was able to come home. And I said my name to him, and he asked me to repeat it again, and I let him know, and he was like, interesting. But he was very proud, and that was something that was a big moment for me. I think, of course, it's different because I fortunately didn't have to go through the adult system like Jamie has. So I have been able to make more progress and be outside and actually show people, which she isn't really given that full opportunity like I am able to be, physically present for that. Um, what I want to do in the next 20 to 30 years, well, I would like to continue to support efforts that kids aren't being sentenced to life or those harsh sentences, that they don't have to go through these situations that lead up to these decisions if we can address like the first harms that happen in communities and show people support so they have better ways And I think also, one thing I would want to throw in is, the district attorney threatening me with, such a serious charge is that I clearly didn't need it. Of course, like I had to do a lot of healing and a lot of work to understand like what I did and everything and grow. But I've already turned it around and been utilizing it even to help other people. So I want to continue doing that.
Yeah, and
That's
I'll
great.
just add to that. I mean, like I think about some of the things that we hear when we talk about juvenile lifers and when we talk about um, folks that have served long sentences that have now come home. Sometimes some of the pushback that we get on the narrative that we know is true is that, well, is it the prison that helps, right? Is it them going to prison for decades? That's why they're better. Um, and I think that Amina is living proof that that's not true. If we give kids the opportunity to grow and change within their own communities, um, they can thrive and flourish, right? We don't need to be sending folks to decades of incarceration in order to see that change happen. And I think that when we talk about juvenile lifers being so successful, it is in spite of the system that incarcerated them, not because of it.
Yeah. Annie, I'm going to turn back to you for your thoughts on sort of how we operationalize some of these things we're talking about. So it feels to me as an outsider, I'm not the one doing the mitigation reporting, but it feels like the elephant in the room is reoffending, and that the fear of that is being considered more significantly than the potential of the person in front. So I'm curious how you think about how we help judges and prosecutors, I mean, I mentioned the DA, see the positive arc before it happens, and how can mitigation impact a process so that maybe those two sides of the scale are treated more equally, because that's the reality. People are more likely to actually grow up and live good lives if we treat them appropriately than they are to reoffend. So how can we actually make what's true real?
Yeah, I think we see in our criminal justice system the same mistakes that we repeat sort of in our society across the board. We operate from a place of fear and from a place of response to a minority as opposed to response to a majority. So it is that fear of like that tiny off chance of something negative happening that we then attribute all of our decision making to, as opposed to the likelihood of what we know most often happens, because we're operating from a place of fear, as opposed to a sense of hope. Um, we're asking judges and DAs to use their imaginations. We're asking them to have hope. This is hard to do because judges and DAs, do see some of the worst of society every day in their jobs, right? The courtroom is full of trauma. I forget who it is, but I think it might have been, I don't remember the author, but someone wrote about trauma and talked about how the courtroom, if you wanted to think about a perfect scenario to re-traumatize people, a courtroom setup in the United States is like you hit every single point of it. People there are suffering, they see people who have been forgotten, who have been pushed out, people experiencing the worst days of their lives, right? That's what judges and DAs see every day. And in that system, we are still asking them to have hope. Um, youth on its own diminishes culpability in the legal system. Like that has been established. That is, we know that as a fact. However, in practice, it's often forgotten what that actually means. It might mean that they're not eligible for life without parole in most cases, but that doesn't mean that judges then take that to consider what it actually means. And like I said earlier, 35 years is still an extremely punitive sentence. Jamie was 14 years old when she was sentenced to that. That's more than the amount of time she is, almost 3 times the amount she had been alive. I mean, almost is, my math is terrible, but it is a significant amount of time, especially for a 14-year-old. I've had 15-year-olds I worked with who said that 15 year when they given an offer of something like 15 to 30, that sounds like a life sentence because that is literally how long they have been alive. It makes sense. And it is our responsibility using mitigation to remind judges of why youth is a diminished capacity, why youth diminishes culpability. It is not just because of when we often think about brain development, and, the kind of idea of what teenagers are and how they make poor decisions. And that is not the only reason, although that's certainly a factor. And that's also why it's important for us to remind judges of the scenarios in which the decision making that a lot of the clients we're working with are making these decisions, right? If you are growing up in a suburban area that is upper middle class, if you are white, you are much more likely to have a limited amount of sort of menu of bad decisions that you could possibly make, right? The decisions that you are going to make likely are not going to have as many negative consequences as someone who is growing up as a young Black man in Philadelphia, right? There are very different situations there. And so it's our responsibility to remind judges of the circumstances of the people that we're working with life. Why the decisions that they made were even on the table to be made. What were the circumstances of their life that informed their decisions that they made? Coupled with the fact that they are teenagers and they are acting impulsively. They are acting within a group setting. They're acting from a place of survival mode almost constantly. And then on top of that, young people are uniquely capable of change. They're uniquely capable of growth. They are not without hope. And there should be plenty of room within the system to provide them what they need in order to get to that place, to complete that positive narrative arc without decades of incarceration. Yesterday, Jamie and I were talking on the phone, actually, and she reminded me as we were chatting about kind of the relational, and she spoke about it in her answers of the relational, like how healing is inherently relational, right? And how much easier it is to heal when we are surrounded by people that love us, that see us, that know us. Young people need community. They need to be with their loved ones. They need to be with people that see them and respect them. Jamie wrote so beautifully about how much the love and forgiveness of her incredible family played a huge part in her growth and healing, and to getting her to where she is today. I guess it's, imagine if we had a system that messaged acceptance rather than rejection, right? Imagine if we had a system that put in place the same kind of messaging of you're not without hope, you are not broken, you are capable of change, that seeing somebody, a teenager, in their worst moment and pulling them in rather than pushing them out, right? Messaging acceptance rather than rejection. If we had a system that looked at people who were accused of causing horrific harm and said, I love you, and we believe you can move beyond this, that you're more than this. With mitigation, we're asking judges and DAs to see themselves, and to see the children in their lives, either their children or others that they know and love, in the young people that we're working with. We really want them to imagine what those young people can be, to be kind of realistic of when they can become that, right? We don't expect young people to snap their fingers and change. Growth, maturity, it all takes time. Like I said, like I've known Amina for a long time now, and I just continue to see the growth and maturity. It's so exciting to see you become this amazing young woman, and with everything that you bring, right? And that is what is beautiful about young people. And we forget that, when we look at them as only causing harm, not rather than cause good. We, our society, have this sort of fear of teenagers that we've developed, right? And instead of looking at adolescence as this beautiful, funny, exciting moment, we sort of look at them as potential enemies in some way. We know young people can get there. We know they can complete that arc. We know it. We've seen it. We've seen young people who have caused real harm complete that arc. It's our job as adults and as the system to help those young people get there.
Thanks, Annie. We did have a question in the chat as we transition to Q&A portion. I encourage people to use the chat, use the Q&A function. We'll monitor both. Amina, maybe I'll start with you for this one because the question that came up is if maybe the first step is for the person that caused harm to be in the same room as the person harmed and to acknowledge their responsibility. The question is about, you know, how does that even come up when you get caught up in the system? Did your lawyer allow you to acknowledge responsibility? Is that something? So I'll ask your personal experience, and Annie, maybe you can answer sort of more largely about what's the relationship between telling the truth and being in the system right now?
So I guess like if I answer this question personally, it's gonna get a little complicated here. As you know, Annie knows because she worked on my case. I had a little bit of a unique thing, and that's, very important when she brought up, the circumstances of people going through the system because the person that I committed harm to was actually also harming me, which wasn't something that was even considered or brought up really. Other than them trying to get more charges than just put on someone else and have me go through a lot of interview processes. So that wasn't really an opportunity that anyone brought up to me. Do I think that that's something that's important? Yes. In my particular case, that probably wouldn't have been like a good first step. Not to say that it's completely impossible. But that I did some other work for my at Care Not Control where we were doing like restorative justice circles, and that's basically what I'm getting from this question is probably that is what you're talking about, and it is a good thing that is proven to be one of the best steps of healing and having someone, not only the person who caused harm, be able to like resolve themselves, because that's not all that's important. It's also important that the people who are then affected by that harm to get some type of closure, which never really happens. I don't, it was an opportunity for me and I don't see it happen often.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Thank you, Amina. Yeah, when that question came up, I was like, I don't know if this applies directly to Amina, but you answered it beautifully. Um, I think about Jamie's case, right? And I think about there are plenty of victims, survivors that are not necessarily interested in decades of incarceration as the answer. And their voices sometimes stop being listened to by those in power, when they're at odds with what the powers that be think should happen here. Specifically in Jamie's case, the victim survivors in her case, as she mentioned, the victim in her case was her mother. The victim survivors in her case were her father, her grandmother, her maternal grandmother, her maternal aunts, her brother. And the majority of those people immediately did not want Jamie to be charged as adult. They begged for her and continue to beg for her to not be victimized twice, to not have Jamie removed from their lives. They continue to be Jamie's biggest support systems. They are fierce advocates for her, visit her frequently, stay in touch, but they are also being put through this, and the family has not really been able to come together and heal because of the system. And again, you have to wonder, who is this serving? Who is it serving for Jamie to be incarcerated? Who are the people that want this? Not the people that are most affected, certainly. And so even in situations where healing is happening in spite of the system, it is not being honored by the system necessarily. I think restorative justice dialogues and bringing folks together are hugely important, and there's a lot of potential there. I think anyone who has worked in a courtroom has sat in those rooms and seen the deep, deep pain. And folks are divided physically often. There is an aisle down the middle of the courtroom where the victim survivor's family is on one side and the person who's accused of causing harms, people are on the other side, and never the two shall meet. They are kept very separate from one another. So the animosity, the pain, the kind of demonization of the other sides that happen just makes it exponentially harder. So I am excited about the idea of restorative justice entering this field more. It feels like young people, and I know YASP and Healing Futures has been doing amazing work in Philadelphia, bringing this to the juvenile justice system. But until we start accepting that that restorative justice can be utilized in cases where there has been an element of violence and physical harm, it's difficult to know that we've really embraced it. So I hope that helped answer the question. But
Yeah, and I think that last point is one worth raising up, that you see diversion and restorative practices being used with property crimes far more than you see them when a person has been harmed, and we need to be able to expand that approach. I mean, I'm going to give you an opportunity because there was a follow-up question about how did you start a restorative justice circle, and I think that may give you the opportunity to share a little bit about your work with Care Not Control, and what you do with them.
Yeah, I'll shout out our podcast too. We actually have a podcast where we did do like basically like a circle healing where we did talk about that and stuff. Unfortunately, and like I see the second question too. It kind of goes with that, so I'll just try to answer both. Unfortunately, like starting a restorative justice circle, like Annie said, like there's so much of a divide already, and it's really just about people's willingness to be able to do that, and then also being able to give the person who caused harm the opportunity to even participate in something like that, which isn't offered usually ever. Like, the courts don't do that. So you'd have to have two willing parties, which, it's just like starting therapy for anything. You'd have to want to do it, and it's hard to want to do that, especially because like that can be mentioned, gang violence, that stuff can run really deep. And, it's not me to say get over it or anything like that. And that's not the point of it. But it just takes two willing parties to be able to sit down and have those kinds of circles where it's just really just discuss like how people were harmed, and like the acknowledgement of, because, the people who offend, sometimes don't even understand like someone's grandmother could be, an extension of their harm. It's not just immediate family or whatever that may be. So the family would definitely have to be, I think, willing, and so would the person to be that caused harm to have that conversation. And then Autumn also dropped the podcast. She's my director at Care Not Control. She dropped the podcast in the chat for anyone that would like to tune into that as well.
Always ready for the commercial when the opportunity comes up, right?
Yeah. And then I see the continuation of the last question. So when I mentioned that we did it in Philly, that was part of the episode that I mentioned, but it wasn't something where we actually had like two families. It was more so of like how can this work and how it's supposed to work. Unfortunately, it's not like something that is, at least that I know, like that I've been participating in, that I've been able to like constantly see with real people in physical life, but I have heard examples of it working.
yeah, and it is hard too because young people, one of the things that we encountered with sort of accepting harm and responsibility for folks who were incarcerated is that, for decades they've been trying to fight to get home, and the only way to get home was through, appealing their cases, right? It's like that's the way you come home. And so we have a system that sort of actively works against accepting responsibility as a part of the system itself, if that makes sense. It's not a system that rewards that in terms of in terms of sort of how someone's case is dealt with often.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big answer to Roberta's question about could it work is sometimes. Like we have to start somewhere and make this an opportunity so that people see it as an example. I think all of us that have lived and worked in this work see it occasionally,
Right.
but the system is not built to promote it as an option. Sorry, Annie, was there more you wanted to add?
This is a tangent now about restorative justice because it's something that I think is really important and I hope is the future of how we're dealing with things. But I'll just say that, even the idea of work, like my question is, what does that mean? What is working, right? Like, what does that mean in terms of Like, what outcome are we looking for? If there is a chance for healing to happen, if there's a chance for some sort, and as Amina beautifully put, closure, what does that mean when you have when serious harm has been done to you? Is that something that we can ever really gain as a person? I don't, I'm with you, Amina. I don't think that is something that we can ever gain. I think grief and harm and trauma is something that we learn how to live with, that informs us as we move forward. It changes our lives forever and scars it, but that doesn't mean that that scar ever goes away. We can help it heal faster. We can help us look at look at it differently. But it will always be carried with folks. There is no fixing or undoing that harm, which is one of the things that make restorative justice in cases where harm has been caused so difficult. But yeah.
I'm curious, Annie, and this was not in our prep call, but I'm curious what it feels like because I imagine there's a mixture of incredible pride and also frustration that only one of our two guests is home. So when you have these conversations with client partners you know so well, what's that like for you as a practitioner?
Mm. I mean, I feel deep frustration that Jamie can't be with us here today. I just think about, and even just thinking about like wanting to introduce Jamie and Amina, because I think you two would get along really wonderfully. And like, you're just such fierce women doing such fierce work, both beautiful advocates in your own ways. And yesterday I was talking to Jamie and I was just really feeling this deep, deep sadness, that she couldn't be here. Even just seeing her picture up on the screen and as we have this conversation, she would have so much richness to add to it. Um, and it is really difficult working with young people and watching this system continue to do what this system does, which is incarcerate. Like I said, when we have such a punitive system to begin with, it's really hard to convince judges, to convince CAs to depart much further from what those sort of sentencing guidelines say, right? And so when you have a young person who is accused of committing a homicide, for example, there are a certain term of years that you're sort of looking at, and automatically they're saying, we're not going to, that just because of what they're accused of doing, this is not a case that's going back to juvenile court, minus everything else that has to do with it. So, and and that is really, really frustrating and deeply disappointing, especially with the lessons that we learned from juvenile lifer resentencings. We know that this isn't what it takes. We know that folks are capable of change. We know that folks can grow and come home much sooner. In the wake of the juvenile of Montgomery of Miller, the legislature passed a fix, which was and it's a little bit of a complicated matrix. So I'll just say for first degree murder, if you're a young person, for the most part, you're looking at 35 years to life. When we did resentencings for juvenile lifers, we brought folks home sooner than that because that statute didn't apply to them. We as a system are saying that that's not right, right? Like as a system, judges, DAs are making offers below what the statute says today. So we can look at people and have so much grace for them once they have come through that change. But when we see teenagers who are still in the throes of figuring out who they're going to be and how they're going to move on from this terrible moment in their lives, we don't have that grace. And it is deeply frustrating, and disheartening to see. And to see young people, I think about one of our client partners who was sentenced, he ended up taking a plea deal because of how high the potential was for what he could get if he went to trial. And the plea deal was for 25 to 50 years. He doesn't need to be incarcerated. He's doing amazing. He is crossing all the I's, dotting all the T's. He should be home with us now. And the options for him coming home are basically commutation, sooner than 25 years. And if not, if he doesn't get that, he'll be serving another 20 years. And again, I just have to wonder for what and for why. What are we doing and why are we doing it?
Yeah, we've talked about the fear that's driving some of the judges and DA's responses, and I think that takes us back to the question that Tyson Smith asked in the chat. Because Amina, you mentioned the sort of through your advocacy, you ended up coming back into contact with your judge, which I imagine is rare because those that actually have more positive outcomes from the system, don't want to revisit the trauma of experiencing it, so they probably don't go spend time with their judge. I'm curious what you think about, do you think that informs the judge? Are there ways that we should be doing that more so that when there are successes, the judges hear about it? Because I feel pretty confident when they give someone a second chance and there's a reoffense that they probably hear about that.
Yeah, so this is actually I'm gonna answer this kind of like in two parts. So
Yeah.
I would say yes, my judge, he was a good judge, I think, because I actually got the opportunity to work with him again through advocacy. So I had seen him with a couple different cases and kids and stuff, and I think he did give like a lot of opportunities. Now, those aren't kids that were being charged with the sentences that I was getting, and when you're direct filed, that's what it's called when you're handed an adult sentence as a youth. You don't talk to your judge. That's kind of something that the DA just does. And then I would have actually never have seen that judge. So in the case of being direct filed, that it w wouldn't have mattered if I met the judge afterwards because doesn't make that decision. And then um like the influence, like there's only so much that they really can do. It's not like he could have changed anything. Like I still have that on my record, which makes it difficult for people. Like even with that, Mark, like coming into the back into that type of work, it's hard to even do that with like that stuff in your record. I was just thankful to get a job that actually was trying to put me with kids based on my experience. Otherwise, I probably would have never seen him either. So I'd say it's like half and half. Like he probably did definitely appreciate that and had some reconsiderations. I definitely witnessed him work with kids and give them like many opportunities to get school back on track and stuff because that's something that is important in juvenile court. But in adult court, the judge doesn't even make that decision. Wouldn't have mattered.
Which is an important point. Annie, as we get toward the end here, we have two guests today, and one of them experienced the mitigation process at the front end, and one of them did not, which means Amina's whole person was present in her court proceedings, whereas that was not true for Jamie till later. I'm curious just your thoughts on. I mean, it's crazy to think about what Amina just said, that it's not even a judge that determines whether a child gets charged in the adult system. The prosecutor gets to do that. Um, Give us your commercial about why mitigation should be the expectation.
Mitigation should be the expectation because we need to understand more about the people that are encountering our system. Um, Nobody else in their life is judged on one act. And that should not be the case for anybody involved in the system, let alone children. Judges need to understand more about young people, about their potential, about who they are, because often they're, made into monsters in the eyes of the DA, in the eyes of the judge. Um, on top of just the individual uh, aspect of it, we I want judges to think about young people in a different category, to think about and start expecting to see more information, to want to have more information before they make decisions just based on maybe what the person is charged with, as opposed to all of the aspects of their being. Mitigation. Obviously, I'm a mitigation specialist, so I'm biased. Mitigation is crucial. It's not just in young people's cases, it's in all cases. There's really not many systems in this world that we don't consider a whole person, that we don't learn more about them. I mean, you think about when you're like hiring someone from a job for a job, right? You get a resume, you get you get a letter, you get your first interview, second interview, final interview. You want to know who you're hiring on. If we're sending people to prison, especially young people, for decades, we should have to know about who they are, about what their hopes and dreams are, about what their future could be. We're removing people from our society that could be doing amazing things and just locking them away and throwing away the key. Amina is home doing wonderful advocacy work. Imagine if Jamie was able to be on the outside too. And so I always wonder, like, who is this benefiting and what can we be doing differently?
Yeah. Um, As we wind down, I will just share that as an outsider in this work, I came to it as a foster care social worker in DC when one of my kids was charged in the adult system, and I kept wanting to say to the judge, "You don't understand who this kid is." And I see in our participant list, I became connected with Free Minds Book Club down in DC, and they helped me learn to advocate and force people to see Joseph, because you cannot make 30-year decisions without getting to know someone. So, Annie, my gratitude for you for the work that you've been doing for years, making sure that people and their whole selves are seen. And Amina, to the work you're doing now and the work you did on your own behalf. We're so, so grateful for the advocacy you're doing, and Jamie on her own behalf too. So big thanks to everyone. I just saw a question come in that we will follow up with you afterwards to make sure you get your answer, but want to make sure we end on time. So gratitude to everyone for being here, and enjoy the rest of your days.